Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I will be sorry to disappoint you. We do work on mob programming in this project, but today we will be focusing on the work we have been doing on continuous practices, and Torvald will be talking about exploratory testing. So my name is Ståhl. I work at Ericsson, and I'm one of the researchers together with Torvald in project number 6. And we have multiple parallel activities, and one long-running part of project number 6 has been this: how can we build better pipelines? And we are currently in the latter stages of a study under the working name of "Won't Somebody Please Think of the Tests?" The background to this is that today, for the last 5, 10, even 15 years, continuous practice in one way or another, and there are many practices. The big three, arguably, are integration, delivery, deployment, but you can hear people talking about continuous quality, continuous security, continuous architecture, continuous this and that. There's basically no self-respecting software organization around that doesn't have some kind of ambition or strategy related to how to be continuous in some way or other, particularly when it comes to continuous delivery, we find. And a big part of that is test automation. And yet, as practitioners ourselves in our respective companies, and also researchers who have been looking at a large number of companies for a number of years, we find similar challenges cropping up again and again across time, across companies, and across industries. And we started thinking about why is that really? And that's what we have been trying to look at in this project. Now, a clever person, Philip Kruchten, a well-known researcher, said back in the dawn of time in 2007 about agile practices in general. He said that unlike genes, which are almost digitally coded, memes are often replicated with low fidelity as soon as they become a tad complex. Agile memes are not immune to this rapid drift. I think that's an understatement, if anything, and it very much applies to continuous stuff, which is why we try to be very clear on at least what we mean when we talk about continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. So for the purposes of what we are discussing here today, when we say continuous integration, we mean a developer practice where developers integrate their work frequently. Usually each person integrates at least daily, leading to multiple integrations per day. This is probably familiar to most of you. It's very, very similar to what Fowler, for instance, has phrased, but slightly different. When we speak of continuous delivery, we mean a development practice where every change is treated as a potential release candidate to be frequently and rapidly evaluated through one's pipeline, and that one is always able to deploy and or release the latest working version of, but may decide not to, for instance, for business reasons. A few words here are emphasized. For instance, we call continuous integration a developer practice, while continuous delivery is a development practice. What we mean by that is that continuous integration is something a developer does. You as an organization cannot really practice continuous integration. You can encourage it, you can facilitate it, you can impede it. But at the end of the day, it's something that the individual does or does not do. And we actually see this in studies that behavior between developers and over time actually varies quite a bit, despite the intentions of the organization. Continuous delivery, on the other hand, is a development practice. And what we mean by that is you as an organization can decide to do that or not. You can decide that this is the process by which we take a source code change and turn it into a product version. This is the pipeline by which we do it. And this is the mindset we adopt, that rather than taking early on a version, identifying it, branching it off, polishing it, making it good and ready to be released, we take a more heuristic approach, saying anything could be a delivery. Everything could be a release candidate. We're just going to chuck it into the pipeline, see what comes out the other end, and if the pipeline says it's good, then it's good. And so that's what we mean by a potential release candidate. And able is important because despite its name, the way we use the term, and actually as Jez Humble in his book uses the term, doesn't really have anything to do with delivering anything. Actually, Jez Humble has discussed this afterwards and said maybe the choice of words was a little bit unfortunate because it's slightly confusing, but it's about the ability to deploy or release and not actually doing it because perhaps you don't want to. There are all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't want to. And then continuous deployment is actually deploying to your production environment. And that doesn't have anything to do with development really. So we think of that as an operations practice. If you want to read more about this, there's a paper, Continuous Practices and DevOps, Beyond the Buzz, What Does It All Mean? It provides more reasoning, more background, and discusses this in the context of DevOps as well. So that's just a kind of a caveat before we start. In this, we will be talking primarily about continuous delivery, but these test automation challenges that we see have indirect consequences for continuous integration and deployment as well. So, the research question that has been driving us in this work is, what are the common pitfalls of software testing in industry implementations of continuous practices, and are there preventable underlying factors? So we got together and shared these observations, and really they were made individually by each of us through the course of our work and our research. And only when we started comparing notes, we began to understand that we were actually seeing the same things. So we started trying to structure this, collated 5 themes of challenges that we have observed. And then we made a survey with 6 companies to verify that these are actually relevant to companies. Then we proceeded with interviews with 22 engineers from 4 companies. 2 of the original 6 were unfortunately forced to withdraw due to the pandemic, but we still have a rather large interview material from 22 different engineers. And then we have applied what is known as a grounded theory approach to try to phrase a theory explaining the observations. Why could it be that we see the things we see? The themes then are pipelines are rarely designed. Much of the work we have been doing over the years has been about how can we become better at designing pipelines. But more and more have come to the realization that that's really the wrong question to ask. The problem is pipelines very often aren't designed to begin with. They tend to rather emerge. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens in a second. We also find very often that test scopes do not reflect stakeholder needs. One important stakeholder, of course, being the customer. That automated tests fail to detect unforeseen behavior. Writing an automated test case for a failure mode you have already seen or can anticipate is one thing, but for something that you fail to anticipate is a completely different matter. We also find that very often full test scope execution is economically unfeasible. You simply have too many tests. And that runtime selection of tests fails to deliver on promises. And when we talk to people in these companies, we find that in general, all of these themes are confirmed by their experiences, but not equally experienced by all companies. And actually, we discern a pattern where these phenomena kind of build one upon the other. And depending on how far one has, quote unquote, progressed along this path, one might have experienced more or less of these challenges. So, to explain how we think this works, let's indulge in a little bit of storytelling. And not all too common experience when you embark on this journey of test automation and continuous delivery is that you start automating tests that can easily be automated. You typically start with low-level tests like your unit tests and your component tests. You start automating the tests you already have and that seem to be simple to automate. because after all, automation is a good thing. Why wouldn't we want to automate? For efficiency, perhaps for predictability, and you have to start somewhere, right? And then we can build from there. This seems harmless enough. And as you go along, you build up larger and larger automated test suites, and that's great. The more the merrier. The more tests you have, the more bugs you can catch. But after a while, you begin to realize that you actually have too many tests. And there is no way you can execute all of them for every change, which after all is what you're supposed to do, right? So what do you do then? Well, then you can start thinking about, maybe we can be a bit clever here. Maybe we can chip away at the test suites and try to select the test cases that give us the most value at any given time. So you can start thinking about, maybe we can prioritize which tests to execute based on the change that was made, which parts of the code base that touches, who made the change, why it was made, or based on which tests we have previously executed, if those passed or failed, or you can select tests based on tests that tend to fail or pass as a cluster. If this test passes, then these other 50 tests typically pass as well. Then maybe we don't have to execute all of them. And this is all reasonable stuff. But it's very easy to get stuck doing that, not because you'd struggle to find your perfect selection algorithm, which after all is kind of a fun problem to have, but rather for more mundane infrastructural reasons. Because you started out the way you did, it turns out that your pipeline perhaps doesn't have the traceability you need to do this kind of selection. Perhaps you don't have the atomicity in your test cases, meaning that your test cases are kind of stuck in very large test suites with implicit hidden dependencies in between them, so they have to be executed in a particular order or they won't pass. That means you can't just select individual test cases. Or perhaps you don't have the homogeneity in the metadata describing the test cases, so you can't map them in a good way to your strategy or to your requirements. And this is unfortunate, and you might come to the conclusion that we actually need to re-engineer our pipeline because we didn't build it the way it needs to be built. Except once you've reached this point, that pipeline has become mission critical. What started out as let's automate stuff to be more efficient, over time you have grown into that and become completely dependent on that pipeline, so that if that fails, then your software delivery process stops, period. So making any kind of radical changes is like open heart surgery, and you really don't want to do that, which leaves you stuck in a kind of vicious circle where you expend infinite resources trying to cope with ever-growing test suites because your product keeps evolving, you keep adding more features and they need to be tested, so you need more tests, and you're under ever greater pressure to deliver speedily. And that's not a very happy place to be in and very difficult to break out of. And despite all of that effort and despite all of the good intentions, at the end of the day, you begin to suspect that despite all of this, these automated tests cannot really detect failure modes that you didn't anticipate in the first place, which is a problem because those bugs are just as detrimental to the customer as things you could anticipate after all. So this is again, not an all too uncommon experience as one embarks on this journey. And so we have proposed a model of this. And the models have to have a name, so we call this the Tapco Model, Test Automation Progression in Continuous Practices, where we capture the story that we just looked at as one path towards continuous delivery. where you start automating what is readily automatable. You realize you have too many tests, they're not really clearly mapped, and then you try to do test selection and it's not really working out for you. And it's difficult to see whether you can actually truly achieve continuous delivery in this way, because it takes more and more and more resources. I tend to think of this kind of like trying to reach the speed of light, where you invest infinitely more resources and coming infinitely closer to the speed of light, but you never really get there. On the other hand, we see another pattern as well, which is starting more from a strategic point of view, having an explicated test strategy of how can we get to this point? What do we actually need to be able to say that a release candidate is good enough once it comes out of the pipeline? And when we say that, we don't mean that other companies don't have test strategies. Everyone has test strategies. Often we have multiple test strategies. But there's a difference whether it's a prescriptive test strategy that says this is how we shall do and that actually steers the organization, or if it's more of a descriptive strategy that kind of says this is what we do. And then in that strategy, we identify the required gatekeepers that we actually need to pass to be able to release software. And we have very clear metadata that maps to the test strategy and maps to the things we care about, such as requirements. And then you can go for automation. But you go for automation for what gives you the most value in this strategy of yours, rather than what is simplest to automate. And that is a very different way of addressing automation. You come at it from the opposite direction. And when you have this foundation, then you can start doing selection to optimize for matching your identified needs rather than to reduce your test suites. Now, we think of this as automation-driven automation versus test strategy-driven automation. But a few caveats. This is a model, and every model is a simplification. This model describes what we observe. It doesn't prescribe how it must be. That's an important point. And also, large organizations, such as the ones we have studied, are not black or white. When they change, they tend to kind of slide along this model rather than just outright flip. And also, different parts of the organization can be different places. I mean, when we have been validating this with the studied cases and asking them, where do you place yourselves and where do we place you, and comparing that and discussing that, we often end up in discussions like, well, me and my test expert colleagues, I think we are here, but the rest of the organization is over there, that sort of thing. And that's fine. And of course, we want to stress that there's more to continuous delivery than just testing. But testing is an important part, and it's what we have been focusing on here. And going back to how we define continuous delivery, we don't regard any of the cases we have studied as actually having achieved continuous delivery, but we see a more or less traversable path ahead of them. So what happens now? We would be very happy to invite you to help us validate this. We have validated it with the companies we have studied, but now we are very interested in determining the generalizability of this. Does it apply just to the companies we have studied? Essentially, have we overfitted to the data? Or does it apply to others as well outside of that circle? And we want to get your feedback on whether this is understandable, if you think it is accurate, relevant, and novel. So we'd love to hear from you if you want to be part of that. And we have ongoing dialogues with a number of cases in 2 additional companies right now, and we'd love to add to that list. Please reach out. You can find me at danielståhl@ericsson.com. And of course, as Christian said, we also dabble in a few other areas, such as mob programming. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow us to discuss that today. But if you want to talk about more programming, if you think that is exciting, also don't hesitate to reach out to me. With that said, I expect that you are all bursting with questions at this point, and we do have a few minutes left. So please, do we have anyone who wants to comment or volunteer to participate right here and right now? I can see a raised hand. Fredrik, please.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting presentation. I was wondering, on the two paths, do you feel that one or the other is the more correct or easier way to go, or are both equally difficult?
We try to be very careful not to kind of place value in them, and try to stress that being kind of farther along in one path is not necessarily a good thing. I think of it kind of like I have a street outside of my window here, and I can tell you what lies at the end of the street, but it's not necessarily a good thing to be closer to that end than to that end. It's just, you know, a place you happen to be. But if you want to get to this point of being able to continuously deliver and having confidence in your release candidates, then we strongly believe that this test strategy driven approach, rather than the more ad hoc automation driven approach is an easier way to get there, based on what we see from the cases we study.
Okay, yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Good.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more hands. If you want to get in contact afterwards, if you don't want to discuss publicly, then don't hesitate to reach out. With that, I suggest we all take 3 minutes to get a cup of coffee before Torvald will talk to us about the work we have been doing around exploratory testing as a complement to these kinds of continuous delivery pipelines. And with that, thank you so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the reporting workshop.